We have another computer in for repair this week, and my producer has reliably informed me it's a classic wedge-shaped 16-bit computer. So I am super excited. Could it be another Amiga to repair? My favourite system after all. And look at the way this has been packaged. Someone obviously loves their 16-bit computer. What could it possibly be? An Atari ST? So now that we have that little bit of silliness out of the way, this Amiga guy is going to have a go at fixing an Atari 520 STE. This machine belongs to Chris. He got in touch recently asking if I'd be interested in taking a look at his STE. Oddly, he called it a 1040 STE, but very obviously a 520. I will have to preface this by saying that I really don't know the first thing about these machines. But supposedly this one just isn't working. It was working fine until one day it just would not turn on, so I'm hoping it's just going to be a power supply problem. Let's get it out of the box and see what we can figure out. But the machine itself isn't the only thing that Chris sent. He also included some accessories that he has for it. And truth told, I don't really know anything about these either. So this is the first time I've had an Atari STE on my bench. In fact, I think this is the first time we've had an Atari anything on the channel. I do own an Atari ST FM, but much like this machine, that also doesn't work. But as I said, I don't really know the first thing about these machines or their accessories. And while we could just rely on Wikipedia or Google, I thought what we'd do instead is reach out to someone in the community who most definitely knows their way around these machines. So putting these things to the side for now. Dave, what's the difference between the various Atari 520 or indeed Atari 1040 ST models?
Hello Glenn, I love talking about Atari ST, so get comfortable. Apart from the very first model, the ST FM that you have is really the proper ST. It has the disk drive, the modulator and the power supply built in. The original didn't. The STE that has just arrived with you is a later revision of it, which was enhanced. The added DMA sound, a blitter, and an enhanced palette and more colours on screen. And it brought the ST up to the capabilities of the Amiga 500, more or less. Sadly though, games rarely did anything with the STE, and when they did, it was usually just to add a few more colour gradients. Now, also added enhanced joystick ports. And if you've got a Jaguar, then the famous telephone-like JagPad will connect to it. In fact, the first JagPad was made in STE colours, but it just didn't catch on. I think Rock and Roll Clams is a game that does support it, but I don't know I could name of any other games that use those ports. Now, you mentioned that's a 1040 STE. Well, the model numbers on the Atari ST didn't follow Commodore's logic on the Amiga, which I think was just to roll dice. The 520 is a 512k machine, the 1040 is a 1 meg machine, and in fact even Atari made badges for people that upgraded their STE to the max of 4 megabytes, which is then a 4160 STE. So if you've been told that's a 1040, then it has 1 megabyte of memory in it. Now, upgrading the memory on the ST-FM wasn't so easy. Some boards allowed you to add an extra 512k to get up to the 1024. But if you wanted to go further, you needed to remove chips or insert piggyback chips, etc. But the STE solved that by having SIMs. So yours probably has 4 times 256k in it if it is a 1040, or maybe more. You could easily upgrade it, and if you're using the hard disk, I would recommend 2 megabytes for it. I wouldn't go less for the hard disk, but there's no difference between the different model numbers of the ST and SE other than the memory.
So thanks very much, Dave, for all that excellent information. Definitely learned something there about the Atari ST models. I didn't appreciate that the only difference between the 520s or the 1040s was the amount of RAM in them. So Chris has been calling this a 1040, and I therefore expect we'll find more RAM on the motherboard than the badge would have suggested. But before we do jump in and take it apart, let's take a quick tour around the outside of the case. This is my first time with an STE after all, and we also need to take a closer look at those accessories. In terms of presentation, in terms of the styling of this machine, well, I do have to hand it to Atari. I honestly think this is a better looking machine than the Amiga 500. It might be hard to tell on the video here, just from the angle that I have you at, but there's a nice curve to this keyboard, and it does feel very natural to type on. Turning to the side of the machine, well, we have here in place of the floppy drive what I can only assume to be a Gotek, or some sort of floppy emulator anyway, and it would appear as if Chris, the owner of this machine, as if he has cut away the original opening here, but he has done a very good job, a very neat job of it. In fact, let me just check that on my own 520. And yeah, while mine does look a little bit mangled, you can see roughly what this presumably would have looked like originally. The other thing that jumps out here is that these cases are different colours. Was the STE produced in a different colour plastic? The back of the machine has the usual array of ports. A modem port? Is that like a serial port? Printer port, which I assume is just a parallel port. Hard disk, and that looks familiar. That looks the same as that. Does it? Would that go in there? Yeah, I think it would. External floppy disk port. Television, which I assume is RF. A monitor port. And equally, that looks familiar because one of the other accessories is this. That obviously plugs in there, and that looks like a VGA port. Switch on the top of it. I would assume, like the Amiga, this machine can output RGB through here, but it will be at 15 kilohertz, will it not? And so not strictly compatible to the VGA standard. Left and right audio jacks, and then the internal power supply. Reset button on the back. On this side of the machine then we have the infamous Atari MIDI ports, followed by a cartridge port and two joystick ports. These must be the enhanced joystick ports that Dave mentioned, because certainly my ST-FM doesn't have them. Rather, it's got its joystick and mouse port on the front underneath. Chris did send along a cartridge, which I presume goes in there. It is this thing. It says Pro 24 on it. Steinberg. Whatever could that be? And then the last accessory that was included with this is this thing. I originally thought this was some sort of external floppy drive. Well, obviously external floppy drive emulator thing. You know, it's got an SD card in here, room for another slot. But seeing this, which presumably goes in there, and then that thing which connects to the hard disk port on the back of the machine, is this some sort of external hard drive? I presume it must need power provided separately through that USB port. I'm not really sure. Well, there we are. One quick look around the machine. But Dave, is there anything further to add, and just what exactly are all these accessories?
Now, on the back of the ST, you did get the ports right. The hard disk is an ASCI port, which is very similar to the SCSI port, the SCSI port, but it came out before the standard was clear, so it's not directly compatible. My Mega STE, for example, has a small board that goes between the ASCI and an SCSI hard disk, a SCSI hard disk. And you worked out correctly, you do have a hard disk emulator there, and because Atari STs are cooler than Amigas, what you have in your hand is a kind of Satan. an Ultra Satan, and it does require external power through that USB port. Now you're right about the case cutting. It would have looked like your ST-FM. Some of the older STs had a much larger diamond shaped button, but the plastic colour should look the same between the two different models. Yours obviously doesn't. And if you retrobrite it, be careful, because there's a plastic dye in that plastic which can be easy to cause it to marble. Now the monitor port is indeed RGB, which means you can connect it to a 15 kHz VGA monitor with that little adapter, or you can use a SCART adapter. The switch allows you to go into the special monochrome mode on the ST, which is a very high resolution of 640 by 400. And in fact, the cartridge you have there is the Cubase dongle, which is the copy protection for the very popular Steinberg Cubase software, which turned the ST into a fantastic MIDI sequencer, which used the monochrome mode. In fact, an ST out of the box with the monochrome monitor, which I have here, and Cubase was standard music equipment in the late 80s and well into the 90s. You could make your own happy hardcore tunes on it. In fact, many of your favourite tunes would have been made on the ST.
So more fantastic information. Thank you very much again, Dave. And yes, the two of us are big fans of happy hardcore, an often forgotten genre of music from the 90s. But the whole point of this video is that Chris sent it in for repair. So let's just plug it in quickly and try to confirm that it doesn't work. I suppose we may as well hook up the video cable, although I'm not really expecting to see anything. Is it doing anything at all? Well, yes, we've got a white screen. The lights have came on and it's beeping at me. Although I think that's maybe just the Gotek type floppy drive here, rather than the Atari itself. And there's the operating system. So the faulty Atari 520 STE, it seems to work fine. Am I being trolled here by the Atari community? Or is there maybe something else wrong with this? Something that might be intermittent. So I've had another quick chat with Chris, who owns the machine, because I've had it powered on for quite a while and it seems to be fine. It's even been loading games from its floppy drive emulator here. Now, I haven't tried the hard disk yet, but Chris assures me that this all seems very strange, because the last time he used this, it crashed. And every time he tried to power cycle it, just nothing happened. It just wouldn't work. So I think what we should do next is let's pull the lid off this and see if we can find anything going on inside that might explain that. Getting inside this machine is relatively straightforward. It's just a few screws on the underside holding it together. It's all these ones in sort of squarish looking holes. Or that's what I would assume anyway, since it's definitely the ones in the square looking holes holding on the front of the case. So presumably it's the same at the back. There are a few screws here in circular holes. I guess would be those are holding in the floppy drive. And longer screws at the back of the case. Need to remember that. But I'm hoping that should be us in. And there we are. Keyboard just unplugs. One very large and very sturdy looking RF shield. That's obviously over the motherboard itself. Then we have this other shield, which is partially covering the power supply and whatever lives here. There's our floppy drive emulator. Not a Gotek per se, rather an HXC 2001. But I suppose more or less the same thing. Power supply. And hiding under that other section, that was the RAM. 4 very fresh looking sticks of it. 1 megabyte 30 pin, would that be 1 meg each? So would that be this machine maxed out with 4 megabytes of RAM? I don't really like the looks of this. Those ground wires coming from the power supply are nipped there just where they're passing by the RF shield. Although I suppose it probably wouldn't cause an issue. I mean, even if that had have worn through and the RF shield was shorting to the ground wires, you would expect this shield to be grounded anyway, so it probably wouldn't make any difference. But I think I may just have spotted the problem. There's a large diode down in there that's coming off the PCB on the power supply. The leg of it comes up through this large heatsink here, where it's soldered off onto it, and that looks like a cracked solder joint. Yep, we have a cracked solder joint there. So if that wasn't making connection at that point, would that be enough to upset the Atari to stop it working? I dare say it may be. And maybe it's just a case actually that through the shipping, this thing has been knocked around enough that this has once again made contact. And when I powered it up there, it just so happened to work. Well, this certainly would be a really easy fix if that's all it is. But I suppose since we've come this far, let's strip the rest of it down and just take a look at the motherboard itself. And there it is, one motherboard out of the machine, but that took quite a bit of wrestling. This power supply in particular, this really did not want to come out. There's two little legs on the front of that PSU, the frame of it. They go through the board there and there. Those were stuck tight, but got it apart eventually. And I suppose the first obvious thing is that this is all just a bit dusty. It is going to need a good clean. I can do that easily enough. Although there maybe is one area of concern here, just at the hard drive connector itself. Well, hopefully you can see there, but it looks like some of the pins on that connector, it looks like they've been pushed back. So we will have to try and straighten those. Hopefully there are no connectivity issues between this and the Ultra Satan. And I wonder actually, is the back of this meant to have something like the back of this one beside it? There's a bit of plastic in there, which itself would stop those pins from getting pushed back when inserting a connector on the other side. But other than that, everything else does look fine. That's the processor, I know that much. That's the RAM, obviously. What's the rest of these components doing? Should we maybe annoy Dave one more time? Could you give us a bit of a tour of the motherboard?
So the board you're looking at there is the STE board, and this is improvements over the original STFM, and Atari had settled on a design on it after making a few changes in the original ST. There's a few consolidations there as well. So if we start at the bottom right, we've got a PLCC version of the Motorola 68000. And the Amiga runs slightly slower than the Atari ST, so the Atari ST runs at 8 MHz. On the left of this we have the Blitter. Now this wasn't originally present in the ST, although it was meant to be, it just didn't get added in the rush to get the ST to market. So the lack of a Blitter means that scrolling in ST games isn't so great. Next to that are two customs reduced into one single chip now, which was in the original ST the Glue and the Moo. They combined into a single chip on the STE. The Glue is the generalized logic unit, so that spoke to most of the other chips on the ST, and the Moo is the memory management unit. To the left of that you've got those extended joystick ports. If we go up a bit and to the left of the memory sims that you see there, what we have is the shifter, which on the ST did video, but added to the STE we now have DMA sound on the STE, which means it can do more complicated sound than just synth on the Yamaha chip. Next to that we have the sims, and you'll be able to work out how much memory there is from looking at those. A little up and to the right is the Western Digital floppy controller. To the right of that is the DMA chip for the hard disks. Down from that are the ROMs, and for an Atari STE the best fit is 1.62 of the TOS. I would imagine you've probably got 1.62 in there, but if you don't, it's maybe worth an upgrade to that. To the left of the ROMs is the YM2149, which is a nice retro sounding sound chip. It's far behind the capabilities of the Paula, which is why DMA sound was added. But unlike DMA sound, that's all the STE had. That's all the ST had compared to the STE. The original ST had a fairly basic sound, a very similar chip to what the Amstrad CPC and the Spectrum 128K had, although it has its charm and I love the way it sounds. And below that, we're back to the CPU, and the bus tour of the ST is finished.
So thanks again, Dave. We now know our way around the STE's motherboard. Not that we actually need to do anything to this, because it all seems to work fine. But it's always nice to learn something about a machine that you know nothing about. In terms of what we're actually going to do to this today, well, the problem seems to be isolated to the power supply and that cracked solder joint. Although, having a closer look at this, it also seems as if that solder joint there, that might also be cracked, as is that one. Now, we could just easily reflow that and call it a day, but I'd like to return this machine to Chris, with it at least being improved in some regard. And so Dave has recommended that we recap the power supply.
It's worth doing a recap on the power supply. It fixes a few issues with smoothing the voltages out to make things proper on the video output, etc.
Now, the go-to place online for getting capacitor kits for the Atari, in fact for getting most things for the Atari, would be the Exos shop. In fact, those 4 memory modules, that's where they came from. But in typical fashion, his recap kit for this power supply, the DSP508A, well, it's out of stock. But unlike some other online resellers, well, Exos actually provides a detailed list of what all the components are. And in fact, he's done a breakdown of modifications that can be done to this to help improve the stability of the 5V output. And within that write-up, he's even provided us with part numbers of replacement capacitors and a recommended replacement rectifier. So I've got all those components, and I think that's what we'll do. We'll swap all that out, obviously repair those couple of damaged solder joints, and that hopefully will be enough to ensure that Chris's STE here continues to work for him flawlessly for many years to come. The board itself, much like say an Amiga 500, doesn't need recapped, and thankfully so, because look at the amount of capacitors on this, and they're all axial caps, or the vast majority of them are. It would cost a fortune to try and recap one of these boards. Right, let's get this PSU off the frame, and time for a soldering montage. Okay, that's all the caps done. The next thing then is to try and reflow these 3 diodes here, where they pass through and are connected to this heat sink. Next up then, I'm going to replace the hot glue that was holding the caps originally. I'm using this black stuff, it's just the same as the clear hot glue, but rather than use the hot glue machine itself, I'm going to use the hot air gun to melt this into place. We've replaced all these capacitors, and I thought I was finished, but then I noticed these two. This one is a 1UF 50 volt. Not sure what this one is because it's got this like heat shrink around the outside of it. But I suppose since we're doing it, we may as well replace these as well, and we'll start with this one. It's 25 volt, 100 microfarad, so let's get it replaced. And look what I spot, another cracked solder joint on this power supply. Well, let's test it. PSU is hooked up. Not going to bother with the keyboard or the floppy drive or anything. I think the STE boots okay without any of that connected. I would expect it to. And yes, on that capacitor that had a bit of heat shrink on it, I put a new bit of heat shrink on it as well, although I'm not really sure why it had a bit of heat shrink on it to begin with. But anyway, power on. So we're getting a display on the screen, but what are our voltage levels? Just going to test them here on the floppy connector. 5 volt is 5.06. 12 volt is 12.3. Marginally on the high side, but I do think it would be okay. There's no trim pot or anything on this power supply, so I have no way to adjust that voltage. I suppose it is what it is. Maybe by the time I have the floppy drive in here, it will help settle things down a little bit, just give that extra wee bit of load, maybe the keyboard as well. In fact, let me hook all that up and we'll try it again. Okay, there's the floppy drive, there is the keyboard. Power on again. What is our voltage level now? So 5 volt, yeah, 5.05. 12 volt, 12.39, 12.4 more or less. That's just what it's going to be. I would be more comfortable saying 4.95 rather than 5.05. But it's so little over 5 volt that it probably will be fine. And Dave reckoned that doing this may help improve the picture quality. Although the RGB picture was razor sharp to begin with. But let's just compare side by side here. The TOS desktop between how it looked when we powered it on earlier to how it looks now. Can we see any difference? And well, to my eye, nope, they both look pretty much the same. But putting aside any potential benefit there, the power supply is recapped, all those cracked solder joints, they're all fixed. Hopefully that gets this Atari STE sorted. Next thing I want to look at though is this hard drive port. So as you can maybe see, there are 3 bent pins. This one at the end here, and then these 2. And as I said earlier, I think that's been caused because there's no backing to this, same as there is on this one. And when this has been inserted, well, wow, you can see just how much it's pushing on that pin in particular. Can I hold that in position and try to wrestle this pin back in where it's meant to be? Yeah, that sort of wants to be more like that, but I bet you if I undo this and then put this back in again, those will get pushed out. Yep. Not just as bad that time, but they definitely are moving. So I'm going to try and 3D print a bit of plastic to go in there. This should hopefully offer some support to the back of those pins. It just seems to be that row there, which is the top row on the socket. The bottom row, obviously the legs coming up off the board aren't as long, so they can't flex as much. So I printed this little bit of plastic, 1.5 millimeters thick. It should fit in here. And yeah, it does. Although we're going to need something to hold it in place. I don't think normal super glue would do the job, to be honest, so we'll use a bit of epoxy instead. And you can see it's just fell out of position. It is ever so slightly too small, but the epoxy should hold it there nicely. And God help the person who needs to take this off, because they're not getting it off. But hopefully it won't have to be me. Right, okay, this stuff is meant to cure in 5 minutes. So let's just give it 10 minutes to be sure. And then we'll try inserting this again. Well, that's been sitting there for almost 20 minutes now, actually. I just went and did a bit of editing. I seem to do YouTube differently to everybody else. I edit a video as I go, so everything you've seen up to this point has already been edited. But anyway, that's been sitting there for, as I say, about 20 minutes, but it's still soaking wet. So much for sets in 5 minutes. Although, we'll give that stuff the benefit of the doubt, it isn't the warmest in here at the minute. But we do have something else to do. Dave has recommended another little bit of maintenance that we could carry out to the STE.
I would also suggest that you reflow the joystick and mouse ports. Now, you'll notice that the joystick and mouse ports are built into the keyboard, and they're accessed in that kind of weird way where you need to lift the ST up to put them in. And quite often, those have started to crack the solder joints in those, so it's worthwhile stripping the keyboard down and reflowing those joints there, otherwise it can turn into a problem later.
Well, I suppose there's not that many screws in the bottom of this. And at least if anything, it'll give a chance for that epoxy to dry. We're missing a screw. And there definitely has been one in there before. But I do think the other, 50 screws, well, maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but all the other screws, I think they're more than enough to hold it. Not sure if this one and one in there, if they need to come out, or are they just holding the bracket there? No, the membrane doesn't want to come up, so let's try and take those out as well. And is that going to allow this to come away? Need to watch the LEDs, obviously. And would you look at that, someone has beat me to it. Those have been reflowed before. Although it's not the neatest soldering job I've ever seen. So we'll just go in and hit them with a little bit of fresh solder. Yes, I just made a mess. A little bit of flux should sort it out though. There we are. And that's it reflowed. And I suppose while we have it apart, let's just give it a quick clean. It is a bit dusty, but I'll just do that with a bit of glass cleaner on cloth. We don't need anything too abrasive here. Nice hard membrane keyboard. Yeah, I'd definitely say this is a step up from the Amiga keyboards. Other than the very first Amiga 500 keyboard that had the mechanical switches. So let's just put it back together. The hardest thing about this really is that you sort of need the keyboard to be floating. Because if I put that down on the desk, the keys get pushed in, so all these rubber domes come up and they may move into the wrong position. You need all the keys to be hanging down. But I think that's us. The LEDs are back in place. Let's just put all the screws back in. And I think if I just do the four corners first, that should just ensure that the PCB is held in place and none of those little rubber domes can move. Then it's just this bracket. And that's it. Maybe give the top of this a clean as well. I'll just do it in the same way. There, that just tidies it up a bit. 24 hours later, and I've just went ahead and reassembled the machine. Hopefully this is dry by now, and yeah, of course it is. And hopefully when we now insert this thing, nothing there moves. And yeah, that's all good. It is quite tight to get that into the socket, but at least now when it does go in, we know that it is making good contact with everything, and none of those pins are getting deformed. So the only other thing that remains to do then is to finish putting this back together, and then we can give it a proper test, including testing with the Ultra Satan, because like I said, never had an Atari ST, let alone an STE on my bench. And so this was a great opportunity to see what it's all about. And so let's test it. I am super interested to see how this thing works, because I would consider getting one of these for my own Atari ST FM. The Ultra Satan does seem to be the most highly recommended external hard drive solution for one of these machines. I do have a joystick hooked up here, ready to go, my zip stick. But for a mouse, well, I don't actually have a working Atari mouse. Instead, I can use my trusty Techno Plus from my Amiga 1200. Amiga mice and Atari mice are, I suppose, technically compatible. The hardware inside the mouse here is certainly compatible. It's just there's a different pinout on the wire. And a lot of these third-party mice from back in the day, they had a switch on them, much like this one does, to select between Amiga and Atari. All that does is swap over a couple of the signals going down these wires. I have owned this mouse since the 90s. I bought this way back in the day for my Amiga 1200. I actually really like this mouse as well. It's really comfortable in the hand. But this is the first time that that switch has ever moved. It's now an Atari mouse. Let's see how this works. So I assume we need to turn on the Ultra Satan first. There is a switch on the back of it. We get a green light, a couple of red lights there. It's flashed on this side, presumably because the SD card is in there. Let's power up the machine. And yes, I am wearing headphones here, just so I can hear what's going on. I want to record the audio, but it's a direct record into the capture card. I don't want my microphone here picking it up as well. So what's this? Oh, well, it did bring up a screen full of information there, and now it's gone. But presumably it was just telling us something about the Ultra Satan. Although we're now in TOS. And one thing to pick up on, actually, Dave did mention earlier that the best version of TOS for this would be 1.62, I think he said. It's actually running 1.06. So I'll maybe pass on that recommendation to Chris. Upgrading the TOS operating system is really straightforward. You know, you'd just be swapping out those two ROMs. So it's something that he could do himself in the future if he's interested in upgrading it. So how does this work? Because we've been presented here with an awful lot of hard disks. 6 of them in total. Can we load a bit of software? Well, the C drive just seems to have presumably system files on it. This D drive was open when TOS first booted. There is a games directory in here. And yeah, an awful lot of games. So, okay, that's going down to D. There is one game in particular I am looking for here. But that begins with an F. If we're going to be testing a computer of this generation, much like we would do if this wasn't Amiga, there is just one title in particular that we need to run. And I'm sure you know which one I'm going for. Frontier. Let's see what this runs like on the Atari ST. Here we go. Let's just watch a bit of the intro. I'm also quite interested to hear what this sounds like. Okay. Well, it's certainly no Paula rendition. But maybe, as Dave said earlier, it has a certain amount of charm. Yeah, it's certainly its own thing. And I don't mean to be any disrespectful at all to this machine. It is just quite a bit different from what I'm used to. As Dave alluded to himself, this machine is marginally faster than a stock Amiga 500. So you would expect that this game runs marginally better, but there is very little in it. This is 8 MHz, the Amiga is 7 point something. So yeah, while this will be ever so slightly faster, I doubt in reality you'd be able to notice it. Maybe if the two were side by side. But certainly looking at it here, to me, it seems pretty much on par with what you would expect from an Amiga. Well, other than the sound. But that's enough of that. The asterisk key there, that quit us back out in the toss. So not unlike WHD load on an Amiga, I suppose. And there is one other title that I do want to try and load. Because this die-hard Amiga fan, well, I suppose I do need to confess something. Back before I got my Amiga 1200, I maybe only would have been about 10 or 11 years old. And my uncle, he loaned me his Atari 520 ST. So me and my friend Mark, we played what we could of this one game on the Atari. This machine, okay, it wasn't an STE, but an ST, but nevertheless, this machine, this was my first experience with a 16-bit computer. And the game in particular, it was The Secret of Monkey Island. Here we go. So my initial reaction obviously is the sound again. I'm just so used to the Amiga version. This, I suppose, reminds me of the DOS version, maybe playing through the PC speaker. Although it isn't just that bad, you know, it does have a certain amount of character to it. And to be honest with you, the longer I'm listening to this, it is coming back. Because I do very fondly remember playing this game on my uncle's ST. It was the first time, either me or my friend Mark, it was the first time we'd ever played a game like this. And in fact, funny story. As we must have spent hours playing this game. Hours and hours playing this game. But we didn't realise you could walk back up onto the cliffside. We just walked around this town trying to do everything possible and getting pretty much nowhere. But yeah, it is a great nostalgia hit to see this running here on the ST. It definitely does take me back. What you be wanting, boy? And much like any of these games at the time, we made up all our own voices for the characters. I mean, everybody did that. I want to be a fireman. But I'm going to have to turn this off or I will be here for hours. Because there is one other thing that I want to try as well. And that is a demo. And the demo in particular is We Were At by Oxygenie. And it was actually Dave himself who put me on to this demo last Christmas. And yeah, I have been a little hooked to that demo since then. It is very impressive and has fantastic music. But I am going to have to figure out how to transfer it onto the real machine here. Because while I can't just run it in an emulator or look it up on YouTube, it really is hard to beat seeing something like that work on the real hardware. Okay, well that was actually really straightforward. Downloaded the zip file for the demo on my computer, put the SD card into my machine. All the drives there just appeared in Windows. They're all 256 megabyte partitions. So is that a limitation of the ST? Are you stuck with 256 meg partitions? Can you not go any higher? But regardless of that, all those partitions just showed up in Windows. Just drag and drop the files across. I put them onto the H drive where there was a little bit of space. And there they are. We were. Let's see what this is like. That's more like it in terms of audio. This demo is super impressive, both visually and in terms of the music in it. If I'm being honest, I think from my own perspective, it's the music in particular that drew me in. "16-bit Dance Party." Well, there we are, one Atari STE ready to go back to its owner. The badge says 520. Chris, who owns it, he called it a 1040, but as we now know, with thanks to Dave, this is indeed a 4160 because it's maxed out with 4 megabytes of RAM. I would like to say a massive thank you to Dave for all his help with the making of this video. Definitely could not have done it without him. So thank you very much, Dave. He is co-host of the fantastic This Week in Retro podcast. I'm sure you are more than familiar with it, but if not, the links will be in the video's description. Make sure you go and check it out. And yes, there may have been a little bit of banter back and forth between Atari versus Amiga. Okay, back in the 90s, it might have been seen as a bit more than just a bit of banter, but I like to think nowadays that's really all it is. Just enthusiasts, be it Amiga or Atari, just keeping that old war going, just for the fun of it, really. Because this Amiga guy, I do have to admit, I had great fun working on this machine, and it has definitely spurred me on into getting my own ST-FM out and getting it sorted. My machine doesn't work either, and I'm pretty sure it is just the power supply. Probably something similar to what was wrong with this. So I will have to pull that out at some point in the near future and get it sorted. Definitely want to try and invest in one of these, an Ultra Satan, or something similar to it. You know how I like to build expansions for my retro computers. So if anyone is aware of any Atari ST hard drive projects, anything that I could build, well, please let me know down in the comments. But that's going to be it for this video. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed what you've seen. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Why not hit subscribe if you haven't done so already? Still plenty more yet to come here on CRG, and I'll see you next time.